delighted to hand over to Lelys for our first of two talks this afternoon.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone. I am Lelys Dinarte Diaz. I'm a researcher at the World Bank in the research department, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to disseminate this work. Right, so the paper I'm gonna present today is titled Investing in Human Capital During Wartime, Experimental Evidence from Ukraine. It's gonna be a challenging session because it's right after lunch, and also some of us arrived this morning at around 4 a.m., so I'm not that worried about the audience. I am actually a bit more worried about the presenter, so please be patient with me. Right, so this project is a joint work with other colleagues at the bank, James Gresham, Renata Lemos, and also with other researchers from the University of Arkansas, Harry Patrinos, and Ronnie Rodriguez, who is a PhD student at Harvard. Yeah, so this is the outline I have prepared for this presentation. Let me jump directly to the motivation. So the main motivation for this project is that we do know that failing to invest in human capital during wartime can affect the economic development. There is a very long-standing evidence showing that there are some very important economic costs generated by wars on human capital at different levels, not only at the individual level, but also the macro level. At the individual level, what has been documented is that there is some mechanical effect of war, which is the reduction of the number of years of education, but there are also some indirect effects, such as negative effects on mental health. When the kid is, or when the baby is exposed, when he or she was in utero, there is also some effects on psychometric measures. Like even in the long term, there are some negative effects on earnings overall. So there is very well documented evidence, but then when we observe like the investments of governments when they are affected by war, we observe also that they usually divert investments from like fields related to human capital to other needs or priorities that are perceived to provide some more immediate and measurable impacts, which makes sense in the sense that the governments may have their own maximization function, and therefore they may divert these resources to something that's actually more, that can have more certain returns. And also like there is some additional cost of investing in human capital, such as the risk of further destruction, displacement, disruption, etc. And despite the high economic costs of wars on human capital and this diversion of investments, and probably because of that, there is very limited experimental evidence on intervention that can be implemented during war, and that can also help to mitigate the adverse effects of conflict on human capital, that is on education and health. And that's what we are trying to do in this paper. Why we observe this underinvestment in human capital accumulation, and why it's actually worth exploring it through a research paper. Because on the one hand, we can think that educational intervention may actually be effective during wartime. Why? Because in a context of war, we expect that these educational interventions can address these learning gaps that are caused by the disruptions through the war, and through a targeted support just to reduce the learning gaps, but also it can also have some sort of impact on well-being in the sense that the kids can feel that there is some continuity in the service provision, okay? But at the same time, educational interventions may actually not necessarily improve health or well-being. Why? Because there are at least 3 reasons why they may not work. One is participation. There are internet disruptions, there are power outage, evacuations, temporary displacement, relocations, etc., that may hinder participation, okay? So at the end, we can implement the intervention, but kids are not gonna attend it. Second, the psychological toll. At the end, kids are gonna be more stressed because of the war, because of potential like bombs, etc., bombings, etc., and that may affect their ability to focus. Teachers can also be affected, and they may not be able to teach with the quality they may want. And also, the psychological toll can affect the engagement from the parents. And at the end, can be also another reason why these interventions may not work is because of the parental or the family investments. Families may have also a maximization function, and similar to probably the governments, and they may end up doing similar decisions in the sense that they may divert their resources to other needs within the family that can provide more immediate like returns relative to, let's say, educational investments. Right, so what we are trying to do in this paper, given that there is lack of evidence and we don't know which direction the results may go, we actually we implemented an online tutoring program, which we offered to approximately 10,000 Ukrainian students, which they were enrolled in grades 5 to 10, and it was implemented during the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, and we did that in 3 consecutive experiments. The goal of that intervention was to, first of all, provide causal evidence about the effectiveness of investing in human capital during wartime, during an active war. Second, we also assess these potential channels I was discussing before. We want to know whether it's feasible to implement these interventions, or, I mean, if the intervention works or not. We want to know whether it was because of feasibility or lack of. We also want to know what are the potential mechanisms that can be driving these effects. And we explore here a couple of them based on what we observed that had worked as potential mechanisms from in-person tutoring programs. That is structured peer interactions, attitudes toward learning, aspirations about the future, social and emotional skills, and other complementary investments from the family, that is from the students or their parents. And then we also document the potential scalability of this intervention. What do we find? We find that related to the first question, does it work? Does investing in human capital during wartime have effects on learning and mental health? We find that there are some important effects on math and Ukrainian language, which are the outcomes that we measure here in this context, and the effects are up to 0.45 standard deviations on math and 0.40 on Ukrainian language. Does it translate into also, or does the intervention also affect mental health of the students? We do find positive effects. That is reduction of stress and anxiety, which are the outcomes that we measured in this context. We don't find any effect on anxiety, we only find effects on stress. Then, in terms of feasibility, that is whether students will participate in the intervention, we find that they participate in approximately half of the sessions, 6-7 sessions out of 12. And we also find that approximately 70% of them participate in at least one of the sessions. That is, they enrolled in the platform and they joined one of the sessions, which is usually the margin that's very difficult to change in online interventions. That's why we are measuring it separately. Regarding the mechanisms, we do find evidence of investments, additional effort from the treated students. We also find effects on positive interaction with other peers, attitudes toward learning, and we rule out that future aspirations is one of the potential mechanisms in this setting. And actually, we find some unexpected responses from the parents. That is, when we also treat parents through this intervention, through additional nudges, we find that they reduce their engagement with the students, and that affects academic performance. I'll give you more details about that channel. And lastly, in terms of scalability, one of the pieces of evidence that we use to argue about the potential for scaling it up is that it has very important benefit to cost ratios, which are between 31 to 56, depending on the experiment, which I'll also tell you more about, that they are not necessarily comparable because there may be some like endogeneity in the sense of when I enrolled into the experiment. I'll give you more details about that. Okay, so that's the paper in a nutshell. And I'm going to move to give you more details about the context of an intervention, unless there are some questions about the summary of the paper. No? Okay, I'm going to move forward. Okay, what was the context in Ukraine in the educational system? So during the first 2 years of the invasion, the education spending was significantly reduced from 17% in 2021 to 7% in 2023. In terms of infrastructure, 13% of the schools were completely destroyed. And there was there was some experience in terms of online education. Approximately a third of the students were enrolled virtually only. Another third were attending classes in person, and another third approximately were like attending school in a hybrid approach. Only, I'm sorry, only schools who had shelters in place were allowed to have in-person classes. Okay? And then, because of the pandemic, the Ministry of Education also had developed this All Ukrainian School platform that offered online education through videos, tests, assignments, etc., for grades, for the target grades of our experiment. I'm telling all of this just to give you a sense that there was some experience in terms of online education. So it's like for you to have an idea of what's the context we are working with. Then we also saw from an early 2023 UNICEF survey that approximately, it was actually not the mix, so it should be good quality, or at least there is no selection of the sample, hopefully. And what we saw from that statistic is that approximately 60% of the students were self-reporting or were aware that their performance was lower or was deteriorating, and which is a report that's more or less similar to what the teachers were observing. Also, like more than half of the students were reporting that fatigue and stress were potential causes, or the main cause actually, for the low performance. And also, they report that they will be willing to do additional effort to participate on activities that can help them to catch up with their learning or their performance. In that sense, like what we observed from here, what we learned is that there was some sort of awareness of the learning gaps that they were, or the low performance, and they were willing to invest the time or put some effort into catching up. Okay? Given this context, we identify a very good partner in the sense that they are very well known in Ukraine. They also have activities or operations throughout the country. And they also have this online tutoring program that was very useful for the context, in the sense that they provided this. It's a purely academic tutoring intervention. It was delivered online, which is the only way that we had in this setting to get access to the students, and at a national level. And it also has some, which this is mainly why we liked the intervention. They had developed this very light touch psychological support intervention, activity, sorry, that they were embedding into the curriculum. Note that the activity they had at the very beginning were very, very light touch. So we worked with them and our team to try to improve them, but I'm give you more details about that. So the core tutoring, online tutoring program, it was delivered in 6 weeks, and the kids attended 2 sessions per week. Each of the sessions lasted 1.5 hours, that is 45 minutes. They were receiving tutoring support on math, another 45 minutes on Ukrainian language. Those were the only 2 topics that were they were teaching during the sessions. It was targeted to students in grades 5 to 10, as I told you before, and they participated in very small groups of 3 students only. And all enrollees, that is all in the control or treatment group, were granted access to the Discord platform, where they could interact with the other 2 peers that they were assigned to, okay? Only with these 2 peers. In the case of the treated students, they could interact with the other 2 peers plus the tutor. Then the tutors, they were recruited, hired, trained, and all the process with the tutors was done by TFU. And they actually have very good training program. We were looking at the materials and comparing them to other tutor interventions. They're actually very good. They're very rigorous. So it's we're very happy with the training itself for the tutors. The training is based in a Teach for All standards. Right, so as I told you before, we conducted 3 experiments. In the first experiment, it took place between mid-February and March 2023, 11 months after the launch of the invasion. And during the first experiment, we only implemented the core program. That is the 6 weeks of tutoring, 2 sessions per week, 1.5 hours each, and it was totally flexible. Remember that the tutoring intervention is not like some classes that are based on specific teaching materials, etc. Is that if I have, I don't know, questions about how to solve equation systems, then I go to a session, I talk to my tutor, look, I need to learn how to solve these equation systems, and then that's the session about, okay? That's something important to know, to understand in the sense that we're not teaching the teachers to teach specific content, okay? Oh, sorry, the tutors to teach specific content. Then in the second experiment, it took place between April and mid-June, which was coincided with the end of the school year. And there what we did was to implement the core program plus some light touch academic tools. That includes an assessment during the enrollment stage, grouping the students by ability. I'll give you more details about that. Some diagnostic reports for tutors. That is, we told the tutor, these are your 3 students. Those are their average scores. And they ranked in the distribution of other students in the same grade in this percentile. Okay, we were telling them, look, you are working with type of students, with these ability level students. And we also give them this curriculum-based formative assessment in case they wanted to use these additional tools. At the end, only a few of them reported that they were using these additional assessments, okay? Then in the third experiment, what we observed is that the mental health had deteriorated a lot for the students in particular. So we made the pause, and instead of implementing the third experiment right after, what we did was to do 2 things actually. One is we got additional resources, so we increased the capacity for the NGO. And second, we also work with the Harvard team for refugee trauma to further develop these psychosocial support tools that I was mentioning before. So what we did in the third experiment was exactly what we did in the second experiment, plus these enhanced psychosocial support activities, which included storytelling, deep breathing exercises, icebreaker, tapping exercises, among others. And there we trained the tutors to implement these activities and to try to embed these activities during the sessions, how they can make the transitions to these activities smoothly, etc. Right. So these are examples of the tutoring activities. This is the icebreakers activities in the third experiment, and that one of the examples of these math tutoring sessions. Right. So let me, before I jump into how we designed the experiments and also the data we collected, let me just give you a brief idea of what we are trying to do here. We know that if there is a conflict, I am going to accumulate human capital through different channels, through different ways. One is pure schooling, which here is the first term. I'm going to go to school, I'm going to accumulate capital through that way. Then I'm also going to accumulate human capital in terms of mental health or well-being, okay, which is the term M. I'm also this year, I'm also bringing some capital that I accumulated during the previous year, right? And then which is going to depreciate over time in a fixed value that's going to change over time too. And what we are trying to modify through this intervention is this. Some additional investments that are going to happen and that are going to increase my human capital by a value that we are going to call it the theta, okay? This theta. Then that's how I accumulated capital. But then, following the effects of tutoring intervention during regular time, that is not during conflict, we explore how that theta could affect my learning this year and my mental health this year. And we model or we define that theta is going to be affected by participation, my engagement in that human capital investment, some mechanisms, that is how my learning is going to be changed through, for instance, more interactions with other peers, through more investments in other activities that can increase my human capital, among others. And then there's going to be some other contextual factors that are also going to affect how I accumulate capital, or how I benefit from this T intervention. Okay. For instance, if I am an older person, a student, sorry, whether I'm going to benefit more or less. If my parents have high levels of stress, where that's going to benefit, I'm going to benefit more from the intervention or not. So that's the main idea. And I'm going to provide you evidence about that theta aggregate and then potential elements that are going to explain that theta. Okay, that's the main idea. So please keep in mind these elements, because that's what we are using to explain why the data we collected and also how did we design the experiment. So as I told you, we conducted the study in 3 experiments. They are more or less similar. There are only some variations in terms of the intervention, but also in how we designed the experiment. So in the first experiment, we enrolled approximately 2,500 students coming from approximately 2,300 households. The assignment to the treatment control was random, and we stratified considering some variables. And then the assignment to the groups was also random, stratifying by treatment status, grade, and preferred schedule. Note that in the second experiment, it was more or less similar to the first one. The main difference is that we wanted to have like different or independent experiments. So what we did in the second was to make sure that there was no overlap in the samples. That is, we checked across all the enrollees from the second experiment, we checked their IDs, numbers, the names of the student, the fathers, and we removed those who had already attended the previous experiment. Okay? And then all the assignments was the same. The difference here is also in the assignment to the groups. Here, for instance, if I am a tutor and I have very high-performing students and also very low-performing students, what we know from the evidence is that if I don't have any incentive more than the average effect of the students, then I'm going to teach either to the average student or to the one that's easier to me, which is the high-performing students. Okay? We wanted to rule out that potential channel. And what we did here was to try to make the groups as homogeneous as possible in terms of baseline performance. And we did that doing this sort of tracking of the students. For instance, in a stratum, which is the treated students, from 5th grades with an X preferred schedule, then we ran them, and then we were grouping the first 3, the second set of 3, etc. And then we are assigning them in these groups of students. So at the end, each tutor had a very homogeneous group of students. And then in the third one, it was exactly the same in terms of design as the second experiment. The difference that we also included these eligibility criteria that only students who are living in Ukraine could participate in the intervention. Why was that? Because we actually had this very high demand. The capacity we were able to double, but still the demand was very high. And also we were observing that kids out of Ukraine were having more opportunities to enroll in the educational system, to participate in catch-up programs, etc. Whereas those in Ukraine were facing very limited opportunities. Right. So that's it's a very simple experimental design, I would say. But we are trying to just shut down some potential mechanism through the design, Sarah.
So you mentioned that in the second experiment, there was a component of targeting students by ability, but you mentioned that the tutors were already assigned students with like approximately similar ability. So was there further targeting on top of that?
No, sorry, that's the targeting, like exactly. Exactly. So I was assigned to this group of students, and then I told the tutor, they told me as a tutor, you have this group of students, and on average, they ranked, these are their scores, and their average is in the percentile 50, let's say. Yeah. Right, so we conduct, yeah.
In the first experiment, the intervention is being additive to schooling investments.
Yeah.
I understood it as sort of being more multiplicative, that essentially you're teaching the kids or helping them with what they've learned in SI.
Exactly.
And so if you're not attending school, then the intervention can do much less than if you are attending school and have materials to talk to the tutor about.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I would think about the first experiment as sort of being more multiplicative, a multiplicative term between SI and TI. And potentially for some of the later experiments, there's also interactions between MI and TI.
That's a good, yeah.
I'm surprised that it's all additive.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, that I see because like that function will depend. You mean by the experiment? In the first one will be more additive. In the other one will be more like probably there's some interaction between that. Yeah, that's a fair point. Um, let me know if this addresses your concern, but what we are trying to say here is that there may be some things here happening, but at the end, since this is going to be assigned exogenously to treatment and control to the two kids on average, either if they are interacting or if they are separated, at the end, they're going to be similar between the two groups. And the chalk is going to be only for a group of these students, and therefore that should account, like how these terms are explained in the first equation should not matter.
Just that in order to structurally interpret the theta I, it'd be nice to have to microfound this with some choice problem that parents, students, tutors are all making.
Okay.
And that generates this kind of human capital accumulation as a result of that. Because in the background here, TI, the take up of that is partly a function of
Gonna
SI
affect
and
also.
M. And so it'd be nice to model that and say, you know, this is how people are making decisions, and maybe that varies across the experiments. But as a result of that optimization, you're going to end up with some human capital accumulation equation, and then that kind of helps to interpret theta I a little bit
I
better.
see.
You kind of
That's
have that in the background here. You kind of hinted at that in the intro. It'd be nice for just to be super explicit on what those micro foundations are.
okay. Perfect. Sounds good. In fact, and since you're saying that, actually, that can help us to also try to introduce the fourth experiment that we did for the parental investments, which is yeah. Thank you. That's a good point. Um, Okay, super. Then we collected data in 3 rounds for each of the experiment right before the intervention started, and we collected data from parents, students, and tutors. Then to measure feasibility and take-up data, we had 2 instruments reported from the students in the follow-up survey, and also this what we call the tutor journal. That is, each of the tutors had to report a couple of questions about each of the students in each of the sessions. Then we also had a follow-up survey, which took place right after the program ended, like 2 weeks after, no later than that, and we collected data from the students. And the response rates for this type of intervention and the context, etc., were actually pretty good, between 49% to 62%. Okay. Right. So what are the main outcomes? We measured 2 main categories of outcomes. Academic performance, that is math and Ukrainian language assessment. We use assessment to measure those scores. And there were no standardized assessments for these 2 subjects in Ukraine, so we developed them. We partnered with McGraw-Hill. They gave us the items for the math assessment, and then we worked with psychometricians and local and international assessment specialists to develop the assessments. Each of the assessments included 30 questions, and then we estimate the outcomes using the IRT scoring. Then for mental health, we used 2 measures, stress and anxiety. And to measure that, we used the youth DAS, which is adapted for adolescents, and also had the advantage that it does not ask you were you feeling stressed or were you feeling anxious during the past 7 days. It actually asks you for some psychological manifestations of stress or anxiety, such as your hands were shaking, you were sweating more than normal, like questions like that, like what's the manifestations in physical terms of these 2 mental health issues. Then for feasibility mechanisms, we estimate outcomes related to student attendance to the sessions, engagement and attitudes in each of the sessions. And for the mechanisms we had for the structured peer interactions, we have measures of the interactions in the Discord platform, that is in the groups, whether they were talking about the different activities, etc. And we also have asked about peer support for tutoring activities. For social emotional skills, we measure only 2, grit and self-efficacy. And we measure actually all these measures or instruments were validated with an out of the sample group of students because we only wanted to measure things that were going to be make sense in terms of producing high quality data. So we have positive attitudes toward academic subjects and also future aspirations related to work and enrollment in higher education. And then for the complementary student investments, we measure whether, we asked them whether they were participating in additional tutoring activities and whether they were spending more time in online academic resources or doing homework. Okay? Right. So how are we doing in terms of time, right? Total. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Yeah. Then our sample in a nutshell. We had, as I told you, we had like a baseline. We collected data from 3 groups. Students, like 54% of girls, and they are on average 12, 13 years of age. And most of them were enrolled either in an Ukrainian school virtually or were attending in person. And in terms of the incidence of mental health, 42% of them had normal levels of anxiety, and that was very similar across experiments. What we did observe that change across experiments is the incidence of stress. Approximately 56% of them had normal levels of stress in the first 2 experiments, and that dropped to only a third of them having normal levels of stress. That's actually pretty huge, like incidence of mental health in this population. For the parents, we have like 92% of them were guardians, were women, and they were 39 years old, and between 26 and 43% of them migrated during the war. And lastly, the tutors, the majority were women, and they were on average 41 years old, and 50% of them had graduated studies. In fact, this sample, we were very impressed that this sample is very similar to the average teacher in Ukraine, which is, they have a high, I'm used to work with the teachers in Central America, so when I saw like half of them had the graduate studies, I was like, oh God, this is a different level of human capital for the teachers. We also measure whether they had fixed mindset or bias towards more resourceful students. And we find that at least in terms of fixed mindset, they do not score that high. They are like 0.25 standard deviation. And that's in a measure from 0 to 1. But they do have some sort of intermediate bias toward more resourceful students, which is 0.44 approximately. Right. So we, across these variables and others that I'm not presenting here, but they're in the first table in the paper, we have very good balance between treatment and control groups within each of the experiments. So we use the equation 3 to estimate the main outcomes of of being randomly assigned to the tutoring intervention on the 2 main outcomes and also on the measures of potential mechanisms. I'm sorry. Yeah, Roberta.
From the conflict the students are facing. I'm thinking about some of them. So the question is about what level of disruption from war the students are facing, whether they have daily bombing or whether it's occasional. And I'm trying to think about how something like this could be replicated in the West Bank or Gaza, where some of these initiatives are happening, but on a small scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberta. Yeah, so I don't have that information on top of my mind, but I can tell you that, but we can estimate it. That's what I want to say. I can tell you that what we do have in a figure here is the reasons why they did not attend at least one of the sessions. And the main reasons were like bombings, internet disruption, and a third that some responsibilities, some conflicts with the regular schooling. Yeah. So yeah, it was actually that affected participation. But I can check with our data because we have that. In fact, we have, Roberta, from the Discord platform, we have information whether they were rescheduling the sessions because of internet disruption, energy disruption, bombings, etc. Yeah, but we can try to see that and try to create it, at least a figure to document that. Right, so we also have this set of control variables that we selected using Lasso, and we include this certification stratum fixed effects. We also, yeah, the estimated standard errors clustered at the tutoring group level. What are the main results? Yeah, please go ahead.
So like when you did the design, was there any financial cost involved to the students? Because there is a very inherent correlation between, let's say, cost and the conflict that exists in those areas, right? And how do you think that might have impacted the sample you got and any inherent bias within the sample?
Yeah, exactly. We go back to the bias in the sample. No, so we have, yeah, so I'm gonna, if you wait for me just a couple of additional slides, I'm gonna give you more details about that, which is actually in the last part, about the scalability. We compare students from our sample with other students from the average student in Ukraine using PISA data, and they're very similar. I mean, we find one different in one of the variables. I think it was sex, but but in terms of all the other variables that are more related to, for instance, whether they had access to devices to connect to internet and things like that, they were very similar. That is, any other variable that can affect the enrollment or the participation in the program, they were very similar to the average student in Ukraine. Yeah, any other question before I move forward? Yeah, please.
Stress and anxiety. So is
Yeah.
there a specific reason? Because we're talking about children and children in war zones. So they're not just facing stress and anxiety, it's a very serious level of trauma. And then you also have to like design interventions according to that. Like you would just not need icebreakers or other activities. You would be needing counseling. You would be needing like some kind of social support or support groups.
Yeah.
To engage those kind of children. So could you just elaborate, why did you use just stress and anxiety like in a war zone, and we're talking about children?
Thank you so much for that question. In fact, I forgot to say something. We did not include, for instance, and the main reason is because of the type of intervention that we were implementing. These were tutors. These were people. The tutors were people teaching math, Ukrainian language. They had no like specialization in anything related to mental health, and therefore we try to do like what they can implement with just a training on those specific activities. For instance, I agree, trauma will be, and actually when we had these, when we were working with the Harvard team for refugee trauma, they were like trying to push it, do something related to trauma. But then we asked them, okay, but this is the capacity we have to implement the intervention. Try to give us something that they can do. And that's why we actually did not do anything related to more intensive psychosocial support, which I agree should be ideal. And you'll see the results. Like that's probably how we can, yeah, we can move the. Yeah.
And like it's something even for adults, and
Yeah.
even like even trauma for that matter in a war zone. Like I mean, all of us might be experiencing trauma in
Exactly.
some way. We might have processed it or not because we just faced a war ourselves.
Exactly. No, I agree. I agree. In fact, that's why for this intervention, it was a like pure academic tutoring. It may have, what we are arguing is that since it includes these very light touch psychosocial support activities, may have some impacts on mental health, and that's why we are measuring them. But I agree, more intensive support will be needed. In fact, we are doing something in Armenia right now, which is actually more focused on psychosocial support, and it has like a full year intervention with more specialized mentors, and also with the support from the psychologist from the schools, like, which is a different type of intervention. And we only measure because this scale allow us to measure three, like depression and stress and anxiety. But we did not measure depression because we knew that with this intervention we were not gonna change depression necessarily. It was gonna be a very long shot. But that's the main reason. Yeah, thank you. Right, so what are the main results? I told you before that, okay, let me first explain you what I'm showing you in this figure. In the first panel, we have the effects on math scores. These are IRT standardized scores. And here I have the results on Ukrainian language, okay? So each of the colors represents each of the experiments. In black, the first, light gray, the second, and yeah, darker gray, the third experiment. What we observe is that in math, we are finding these effects. Like in math, there are approximately 0.49 standard deviations and 0.40 standard deviations on Ukrainian language. These are very huge effects for those who know the evidence on education, okay? some, yeah. Then in the second experiment, the effects are 0.22 standard deviations on math, no effect on Ukrainian language. And then the third is very similar on math to the second experiment, and it's 32 standard deviations on Ukrainian language. I know we have like these, we want to compare these estimated impacts, but remember, I told you that these are independent experiments, and more importantly, it's probably that we are observing these very huge effects in the first experiment, because then like the more motivated kids probably enrolled to participate in that experiment in particular. It has internal validity because we have like good balance between treatment and control groups, but at the decision of enrolling into the study, that may have some motivation behind it. Okay, that's why we argue that that's why probably we are observing that very high impacts. At the same time, remember that these kids were coming from like years of a school closure because of the pandemic, and then a couple of years of the Russian invasion, and therefore like additional school closures. So the basic, like the baseline performance was very low. So any intervention, even something very short, could have or we argue that it may have these very high effects. Then the next question is, why do you observe like this zero effect on Ukrainian language and like very lower effects in the next experiments? One is the motivation, but another thing that happened in the second experiment is that the ministry announced that the mandatory exams at the end of the school year were not going to be mandatory. Okay, so at the end, students may have reduced the effort, and therefore they had these like null effects on Ukrainian language. You may also wonder why that did not happen on math. Well, we don't know exactly why, but looking at additional evidence of like interventions, not intervention, but like evidence of education during wartime, what we observed in the case of the Second World War was that students usually try to put more effort on subjects that can increase their abilities that they can take with them when they have to migrate or to move because of displacement due to war. And Ukrainian language is something, skill that they are not going to use if they move, whereas math skills are something that you're going to use like, yeah, anywhere and probably during your whole life. Okay, so if you have any other idea on how we can explain these, like this null effect on Ukrainian language, for instance, in the second experiment, it's going to be very, very welcome. What happened with mental health? So I told you before, we do observe very similar effects across experiments on stress. There is a reduction of approximately 0.12 standard deviations, which translate into approximately 8% of the students moving from above normal levels of stress to normal levels of stress. That includes 5 minutes of Q&A. Okay, so I'm gonna go faster. We find no effects on anxiety. Remember these new results on anxiety? I'm gonna tell you what's the potential explanation we are trying to document in the paper. It includes. Okay, so thank you. Right, so as I was telling before, these are very important gains, but remember, from very low baseline levels, okay? And in fact, they are approximately twice the estimated impacts from other tutoring interventions that were implemented in person, and also some other online tutoring programs that were implemented during the pandemic. Right, now let's move to feasibility mechanisms and our arguments for the potential scalability of this intervention. In terms of feasibility, as I told you before, like the question is, okay, you implement these very nice or interesting interventions, but then, yeah, are kids gonna attend the sessions? It's not clear, right? In our case, it seems that may have driven the results. On the one hand, what we observe is that across the two subjects, the students attended approximately 6-7 sessions, and approximately 70% of them attended at least one session that is enrolled, and also attended the first session, or one session, sorry. As I told you, that's important because that's a very, like the extensive margin is the most difficult margin to change in online interventions. But yeah, okay, they attended sessions, but then probably they were just there like thinking about other things, not engaging at all with the tutor, with the other classmates. So we also try to measure that. And what we found is that is that the student engagement was actually very high, according to reports from the tutors, and only a few of them, like between 3 to 4% of them, came to the sessions without any type of preparation, were not asking questions, etc. Overall, as I was telling Roberta before, most of the absences were attributed to other factors that were more external, but not related necessarily to the tutoring program. That is like power outages, internet disruptions, among others. And the other piece of evidence that to document the feasibility is that you may also think, yeah, good, but then they probably just attended a couple of sessions, but then you can just see like a drop in the last sessions. What we actually see, at least in the first and third experiments, is that the attendance was very consistent over time and over subjects. The only drop that we see, which also coincides with the announcement from the Minister of Education about the final examination not being mandatory, is in the second experiment. We observed like a drop from approximately 59% in the first session to approximately 47, 48% in the last session. Like that's the only drop that's actually very, very high, very important, and that happened approximately in the 10th, 11th sessions onwards, okay? Right, so in sum, yeah, it's feasible. They are going to participate, they are going to engage in the intervention that may drive the effects on learning. Then specific mechanisms that have been explored in in-person intervention, but not in online tutoring interventions. The first one is like interactions with other peers. You don't know whether by being grouped with other peers is going to improve this positive interaction. I'm going to have other peers. I'm going to talk about my issues, etc. Or if they may be some negative effects. I'm very traumatized because of what's happening like in my surroundings, and therefore I'm going to go and be more disruptive in the session. So you don't know whether there are going to be more interactions or not. So here what we did was we used for these two outcomes, well, actually for these three outcomes, data from the platform, and we observed whether they enrolled into the platform and whether they interacted or not with other peers, and whether they have 10 or more interactions, okay? And across all these, something that I didn't emphasize before, I just mentioned it. We granted access to the Discord platform to all students, treatment and control, because we wanted to also like shut down the potential mechanisms that just having access to the platform for interaction is what may drive these mechanisms. It's not access to a platform. It's actually having the platform and then having a tutor that can moderate these interactions, okay? And this is what we are observing here, and that's why we have data for the control group. So we observed that treated kids are more likely to interact. They interact more frequently, and they also have report that other friends are also enrolling in the intervention. Then in terms of attitudes toward learning, we do find also, thank you, that kids treated are more likely to report like more enthusiasm toward math or Ukrainian language, but we don't see anything on aspirations. Remember, aspirations and also anxiety are outcomes related to the future. So at least with this intervention, we can say that a mechanism, like something related to the future is not an outcome that we are going to change through this type of intervention. That's not a potential channel. Then third, social emotional skill, we do find some effects, particularly in terms of, in the third experiment, sorry, we did not measure social emotional skills in the first experiment, but at least in the other two, we're observing some gains for the treated students. And lastly, in terms of students' effort, we do observe like these gains, additional impacts on seeking additional tutoring support, also on spending more time either on online classes. We don't see any difference on doing online homework, yeah? Which is related to the peers mechanism, like they want to interact probably with other kids and therefore they're taking more tutoring activities and also additional online classes. Okay, what happened with the parental investments? What we did here was to conduct an additional experiment like after the first experiment ended. So we worked with a sample of students, of approximately 800 students who were not treated in the first experiment. And what we did with them was to randomly assign them to two groups. All of them were like participate or were granted the opportunity to participate in a tutoring activity. The difference is that for half of them, we also sent SMS messages to the parents, trying to increase their effort or to engage them. And the messages were around 3 main strategies related to reminders, social norms, and accountability. So when we compare the results between the two groups, we do observe the following. Adding or trying to engage a parent through these SMS messages do not change enrollment, attendance, and the intervention at all. We do observe, however, that it can have some detrimental effects on academic performance, although this is not statistically significant, the magnitude is actually pretty important. And mental health is also pointing to the opposite direction, okay? What we did was to also try to follow up with a sample of parents, and we did some focus group discussions with them. And what they were reporting about these messages is that trying to engage them, they were doing already something. And when we were sending them messages, that created an idea of that they were not doing enough. So what they did was to just do not do what they were doing, and just because they thought we're not doing enough for our kids. So that led to a disengagement from the parents, and that's why probably we are seeing these negative effects on academic performance. And that's something actually I found in another paper I did with a parenting intervention. We sent SMSs to the parents, and at the end, the male caregivers withdraw their or reduce, their interaction with their kids. They thought, I'm not doing something good, anything good with my kid. And this is a very stressful situation because it was during the pandemic. So yeah, I'm not going to interact with my kid because I'm doing this in the way that I should. Right, so to wrap up, scalability. I told you before, the cost of this online tutoring program, the whole program, the 6 weeks, was approximately $89 in the first experiment and $93 in the third. The cost in the control group, just the use of the platform, was approximately $7 across all the experiments. So at the end, we estimate that the benefit to cost, the ratios are between 31 in the second experiment, where we observed the lowest impact, and approximately 56 in the first experiment, where we observed the largest. Then what about whether these kids are very different? Because at the end, one of the eligibility criteria was that they had access to a device to connect to the internet and then to join the intervention. And what we observe is that when we compare our sample with the representative student, thank you, in Ukraine using PISA data, they're very similar. There is only one difference, as I told you before, but all the variables that are related to or that can change the engagement or participation in the intervention, they were very similar. We also, another worry is that the areas that were very highly affected by conflict, you probably did not enroll anyone. Actually, we did. And what we observe is that across the 3 experiments, we are observing similar patterns of enrollment across the different oblasts, the different regions. So yeah, so it's not we did get a lot of enrollment from the different regions, even those highly affected by the conflict. Also, the enrollment patterns are very similar across regions, very similar to the population of students across regions. And then something that we argue is that at the end, the tutors were teachers who had this extra capacity. They were not teaching in the how they would regularly in normal times, in not conflict times. So at the end, the intervention relies on this existing infrastructure. So therefore, it's another argument for potential scalability. And very quickly, we show that investing in human capital during wartime, it's effective. It can affect the learning outcome, but also the well-being of the kids. We show also what are the potential channels that may be driving these results. This is also an intervention that's cost-effective and also has potential for scalability. And we know that governments may have this specific maximization function, and therefore we're arguing that the potential policy implications that we may not necessarily work directly with the governments. We probably can also engage governments, but the intervention may be implemented by other NGOs, international organizations, etc. Okay. But what's very important is that it's very relevant to have intervention that can be adapted and flexible, because at the end, maybe that's Roberta's comment related to like there are many disruptions during war, and we almost like we rescheduled each of the experiment at least once because these are very disruptive times, and yeah, we need these flexible interventions. Yeah, so we are we are providing this evidence for this because we know that wars are the usual, the day-to-days, unfortunately. But yeah, we hope that this, or our wish is that they wouldn't be needed. So thank you so much for your attention, and we are going to open it for questions.
We have time for a few questions. Probably, Lelys, you have a better view of the audience. These are much thicker in questions. Gather up three, and then.
Sounds good. Okay.
Hello. Hi. I'm right here.
So I was interested in knowing if you also considered other intersectional factors in interpreting.
Your study that because you say that it is representative of the whole population, like the Ukrainian population. So I'm interested in finding out what are the other factors that you, intersectional factors that you discuss in the interpretation.
Sounds good. There.
I was just curious to know that in the online tutoring sessions, was there ever an input from the students or students' parents' side about considering, given the circumstances, maybe they were either probing to or hinting towards resources outside of just the classroom teaching? Because if like in cases where for example, their crisis is usually individuals who are in position of they don't have to be necessarily social workers, but if they're in a position of directing a crowd, they're often held at a standard that, okay, maybe they can be nodes that can connect to other resources,
I'd say.
some humanitarian or emergency resources at the time. So was that kind of a response that you got from maybe parents or students who were engaging with these tutors?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering the very first slide you showed of results when we looked at exercises for math and for language. So in education literature, as you would know, it's harder to move scores on language rather than math. And if we ignored the second experiment, those are still huge effects. And do you attribute that also to the fact that they were starting at very low baseline? And my understanding is that in experiment 2 and 3, students are being divided into groups based on their baseline ability. So there is some variation in their baseline ability, even though we are considering all of them to be baseline. Do you look at any differential impacts by baseline ability? Is a certain group by ability driving the effects we see in the Ukrainian language scores?
Okay. I'm gonna go. Okay. Sounds good. Let's start with the last one then. Right. So what we did in the second experiment is just to group students and to actually to control for any potential variation within each of the groups. For instance, because the three of us are very similar in terms of academic performance or ability, then we're going to be in the same group, in the same tutoring group. In the first experiment that actually happened, there was variation within the group. In one group, probably it was me who was the lowest performance student, and it was you who was the highest. So there was variation there. And we do that's like just an explanation how we did the grouping. Then in terms of heterogeneous effects by initial ability, we do have some results, but in a Ukrainian language, we don't observe whether baseline ability is something driving the effects. The effects are larger for those students who were performing lower than the median, but for math, but nothing for Ukrainian language. So it's still a puzzle, yeah, but thank you. Then, yeah, so we did not do that, like to try to, that's actually a very good point. And I can check the data, whether they're at least in the platform, whether they were seeking for additional like psychosocial support or other social support more in general. But we did not do that as part of the design because it was a pure or a mostly academic tutoring intervention. And as I was explaining before, we are trying to do that, but for another intervention that's actually focused on mental health, which I agree it's very important for this context. Yeah, and then other factors. Actually, that's the third element. Oh, that's that's the third element we had in the theta in that model, the C, if you remember. So there are also some contextual factors that we do have some like a bunch of heterogeneity analysis that we're including in the paper. I did not go in details, like trying to explain those results. One of the baseline ability, we do find some differences, but for math, nothing on Ukrainian language. We also explore whether exposure to conflict can affect that, mental health of the parents at baseline. We also try to run some estimated correlations between characteristics of the tutors and the performance of the students. Like there are many other things that I didn't have time to explain, but yeah, there are many that we are considering has moderating the impacts of the intervention. Thank you. Do we have more, or we are? Okay, sounds good. Perfect. No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I'm Faiz Rehman, and I will talk about frontier rule and conflict. It's a joint work with Adeel Malik and Rinchan Ali Mirza. Rinchan is also attending this session online, and he will present the second part of this presentation. So these are some headings in the international media about a specific region in Pakistan. And that specific region is located in the northwest of Pakistan. Interestingly, these headings has some correlation with the colonial legacy because the northwest of Pakistan was governed in a different way by the British Raj than the rest of the Indian subcontinent. So you can say the basic focus of the paper is on the colonial legacy effect in the northwest of Pakistan. So if we look at colonizers, they had not only introduced different administrative structures across different world, for example in Africa, but they also introduced different governance institutions within a country. In literature, it has been discussed as direct rule versus indirect rule. Under the indirect rule, again, the colonizers had introduced exceptional legal, administrative, and political arrangements which were unique to only frontier spaces. And these exceptional institutions have three main features. Number first, the colonial state penetration was very low or limited in these frontier regions. Number second, there were very limited avenues for conflict management to solve the disputes among the inhabitants of the frontier spaces. And because of this limited avenues of conflict management, the state has delegated its state power to the local tribal elites. So actually, the tribal elites were the state in the frontier regions. In literature, it has been described as frontier governmentality. And this literature discusses that there are three reasons why the colonizers had actually created frontier regions. The first, when the imperial power faced some external threat from the neighbor, in the case of northwest of Pakistan, the then British Raj was facing an external threat from the then USSR, which is famous as the Great Game. Second, if the cost of extracting natural resources is high, so the colonizers introduced frontier spaces. And number third, when it was very costly to extend the state authority. An interesting fact about these frontier spaces is that you will find them all over the world. For example, you will see frontier regions in Kenya, in Pakistan, in India, in Iraq, in the form of Basra Vilayat. And an important feature of these regions is that they have persisted over the time. Even after the independence of the respective countries, these frontier spaces still existed. So this is a visualization of the frontier spaces across the world. In the right-hand side, presents the frontier region in Pakistan. In the middle, the pink portion shows the frontier region in Iraq. On the left, the whitish part represents frontier region in Kenya. Now, what is the relationship between frontier rule and conflict? There is some literature, but that literature is descriptive and qualitative. And it discusses that the frontier rule is inherently unstable. And that is why it is more prone to sovereignty contesting forms of violence. What does it mean? It means that in these regions, there will be a high probability that the people will fight against the state institutions if there are some there. Now, in this literature, Adnan Nasimullah discusses that why political violence persisted in the South Asian region. And he says that it can be traced back to the different forms of governance structure in the South Asian region, which had been implemented by the British Raj. Similarly, literature too, Benjamin Hopkins discusses that whenever we discuss about these frontier spaces, frontier region, in one way or the other, in the historical context or in the contemporary context, we have to always discuss about a very long history of political violence. So, we are contributing to this literature in two important ways. The first one is that we are providing quantitative empirical evidence that why frontier regions or rule are more prone to conflict. But most importantly, we are contributing that the frontier regions can maintain a social order for a longer period of time, even for centuries. But however, they are more fragile, unstable, and they are more prone to violence in the face of an exogenous shock. So, in the case of northwest of Pakistan, the whole social order was maintained through tribal leaders. And once the tribal leaders were systematically eliminated or targeted, so there was no hierarchical system to maintain the social order in the region. And the whole system of social order has been collapsed. So we are contributing that if these regions face an exogenous shock, then it will unravel social order in the region. So this paper is about to study the effect of frontier rule on contemporary conflict in the northwest of Pakistan. We are utilizing a historical border which had been created by the British colonizers in 1901 and divided the region into frontier and non-frontier districts. For this, we are using spatial regression discontinuity design to study the effect of frontier rule on contemporary conflict inside the frontier region relative to the outside frontier districts. And our study finds that the regions which were just inside in the frontier spaces experience greater contemporary violence relative to the non-frontier regions. And interestingly, we did not find any significant difference effect on violence pre-9/11. So we argue that it is activated by an exogenous shock in the form of 9/11. After 9/11, there is a significant difference in the contemporary violence in the frontier region relative to the non-frontier districts. This is a simple sketch of the argument that how and why frontier regions are more exposed to state violence. So in frontier spaces, as I discussed, that there are limited avenues of conflict management. So that is why the society or the state has to rely on the intermediation of the tribal elites. And when there is an exogenous shock struck the tribal elites are the system, then there is no hierarchical system to maintain the social order, and it will lead to a high level of violence. So now let's discuss some other institutional discontinuities in the frontier and non-frontier spaces. In the non-frontier spaces, which is also called settled districts, the British Raj has introduced formal system of conflict management. For example, courts, police, and electoral politics. And this was not available in the frontier spaces. Similarly, when there was no formal institution of conflict management, actually the colonial state has delegated a state power to the tribal elites to maintain the social order, to solve all disputes in the region. And that is why the tribal elites had maintained a social contract between the state and society, rather than it was the state, it was the society to maintain a social contract with the state. And there was some security infrastructure in the form of local militia, which were used to be recruited from the local population under the eyes of tribal elites. Can you click on that? So these are the institutional discontinuity from the imperial gazetteer of India. On the right-hand side, they are called settled districts. It means when the British had introduced modern institutions like bureaucracy, deputy commissioner, revenue collection mechanisms, justice system like the divisional courts, district courts. On the left-hand side, there was only one political agent, one person who was representing the colonial state, and after the partition, the state of Pakistan, to maintain the social order through tribal elites. Next slide. Similarly, till 1997, there was no electoral politics. Only the tribal elites were allowed to vote in the election. And after 1997, there were some politics allowed, but that were mainly on non-party basis. So these were some institutional discontinuities which have been collected from the Imperial Gazetteer of India. So I will stop here. Now my co-author Rinchan will present the specification and results.
Can everybody see my screen?
We can see your screen, sir.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks a lot, by the way, sorry to the organizers of Pathways to Development / Spread Conference. I'm really honored to be able to co-present with my co-author Faiz and Adeel, who couldn't be here because he's at a different conference at the moment. I'm going to basically talk more about, as you know, following on from Faiz's kind of more conceptual discussion around the paper to more about the specific empirical strategy that we use and the kind of results that we find, and the kind of mechanisms behind those results. So let me start by basically talking a bit about our main specification. So as Faiz already has mentioned, we basically take this border which separates the settled districts from the frontier tribal agencies, which is a very historical border. In fact, it was constructed in 1901 under the then Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon. And that the idea of that border really was this kind of creation of a differential form of rule, a differential institutional arrangement that was assigned to these tribal agencies as opposed to the settled districts. And Faiz has already talked a bit about the kind of institutional discontinuity that kind of entails, which is really our main, you can think of that institutional discontinuity, which consists of, fewer avenues of conflict management, in other words, absence of localized politics, courts, bureaucracy, so on and so forth, and greater delegation of power to localized elites as the kind of treatment that we're trying to, kind of identify in this spatial regression discontinuity design framework that we use to kind of implement in this paper. So here is our basic specification on the left-hand side. You basically have a measure of conflict, which is basically, because we have spatially granular data on conflict, geocoded data on conflict, we measure it at a grid cell level, which is in our case a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cell. And then on the right-hand side, our main variable is whether that specific grid cell comes under what we call the frontier rule kind of, part of the border, as opposed to the non-frontier rule part of the border or the directly controlled district part of the border. And obviously, in this spatial regression discontinuity, we use as our main running variable the distance of a grid cell to the frontier rule border itself. And then we have a whole bunch of covariates for which I'll show the balance shortly. We look for balance across the border in a whole range of dimensions to kind of justify the use of a spatial regression discontinuity design. And we also include a whole bunch of border segment fixed effects. So essentially what we're trying to do here is trying to compare conflict intensity. And by conflict intensity, I primarily mean conflict against the state or against institutions of the state in areas that are just inside the frontier rule border versus areas that are just outside the frontier rule border along the same border segment. So in essence, trying to compare the comparables, so to speak. And the border segment fixed effects that we include is around 20 kilometer segments. Okay, so and as I mentioned, this border was created in 1901 by the colonial authorities at that point. This was a relatively stable border that remained in place at least until 2018 or so, when tribal agencies were formally merged with the rest of the country. Even, although our kind of argument that we go into the paper is that to what extent that formal merger actually has taken place on the ground in practice is also somewhat debatable, even after 2018. As I mentioned, our conflict data is a highly spatially granular data on conflict, which comes from the Global Terrorism Database. It kind of identifies for each conflict incident the time, day, month, year, location, precise location in terms of latitude and longitude, the number of fatalities associated with that conflict event, in terms of either the number of wounded or number of killed. The type of event, is it a political assassination? Is it an explosion? Is it a suicide bombing? Is it a hijacking? So on and so forth. And most importantly, from our perspective, it also identifies the target. So whether the targets are civilians, businesses, government officials, religious institutions, whether the target is the military, or some form of police or other kind of, paramilitary organizations like Khasadars, levies, scouts, and so on and so forth. So essentially, our measure of violence against the state, essentially, you can think of aggregating these conflicts at the grid cell level. And by aggregating, I mean focusing on state targets, right? So we focus on state targets, and then we aggregate the number of conflicts at the grid cell level on those state targets. And that is basically our left-hand side variable, which is the conflict against the state, or intensity of conflict against the state. And we basically consider three different variants of this. One is simply we count the number of events in a grid cell. We also look at the number of people who were killed in those events in a grid cell, and we also look at the number of people who were injured in these events against the state in a grid cell. And as you will see throughout our results, these measures all suggest very similar kind of effects, documenting very similar effects, regardless of which type of specific measure of conflict against the state that we use. As I already mentioned, we're going to show you a balance. So obviously, in one of the key ideas behind spatial regression discontinuity is to show a balance across a whole range of dimensions. In this case, we're going to show you a balance along geophysical factors, things like slope, ruggedness, topography, and other factors that have been, kind of used as explanatory variables in the conflict literature, which includes, by the way, precipitation as well as temperature. And these are aggregates at the grid cell level again. But we also look for, most importantly, I would say, the pre-frontier rules. So these are predetermined kind of, measures of conflict. So, one standard kind of, criticism could be, is it the case that frontier rule was applied in areas where, pre-conflict, i.e. conflict prior to the application of frontier rule was already higher, and are you just simply capturing the higher trend of conflict in those areas? So in order to kind of test for the balance along pre-frontier rule conflict intensity, we use this very interesting volume by Jakes, who basically has geocoded all the major battles that have taken place since antiquity up until now in this whole region. And we basically use the geocoding through that book or digitize. I think Faiz's RA was one of the people who digitized this very helpfully for us. And we kind of are then able to kind of, at least for the major battles prior to the construction of frontier rule, we're able to test for balance across the frontier rule border itself. And we use, the height database to look at grid cell level estimates of population density and try and show balance along that dimension as well. Okay, so just to kind of give you a visual illustration of what we're talking about in terms of this spatial regression discontinuity, over here you have the precise, I would say, area of study that encompasses our regression, spatial discontinuity regression. The shaded area is essentially, across this border, which is the red line, which is the frontier rule border itself. And on the left-hand side of that of this red line, you can see the frontier rule areas. On the right-hand side, it's the non-frontier rule areas, and we look at a buffer zone around this border of 50 kilometers on either side. And that's essentially our area of study, so to speak, when we look at this discontinuity. So here I've basically given us a slightly more focused version, you could say a more zoomed in version of the previous picture, where I've looked at a specific segment along this border, and there you can see the shaded area being obviously areas exposed to historical frontier rule, and the white area being, areas that were not exposed. As you can see, already just by looking at the raw data, you can see that at least, in this segment, that there is a order of magnitude difference, in terms of conflict intensity against the state, just by simply eyeballing the raw numbers. In fact, that was one of the reasons why, when we initially started looking at this data, which got us interested in this idea of historical frontier rule, and to kind of connect that to the intensity of conflict in this area. Okay, so obviously, a very important question from an empirical economics perspective is, to what extent is this border itself exogenous, right? So it could be that, like, again, we get back to that same question. It could be that, the British simply decided to construct this border and lock off those areas where they were facing already a high level of resistance or high level of conflict, and simply that's what we are capturing, right? So essentially, we take that kind of exogeneity of the FR border itself very seriously in the paper, and we have a lot of discussion around that. I'm just going to summarize our argument over here in this slide, and then show all the tests that we do to kind of support this argument. So essentially, the argument rests on the fact that, the British Empire, when the frontier rule border was actually being constructed at the time, the British Empire took great pride in scientifically mapping its imperial domains, right? And that was very clear from what were called the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, right? So they went through this whole scientific process of creating these trigonometrical maps, survey maps of India, of British India, which they kind of were, touting as the latest kind of way of mapping regions at this time. However, interestingly, what we found through a deep dive into the historical literature on this subject is that in frontier areas, in fact, colonial authorities relied more on what were called reconnaissance surveys, right? So these reconnaissance surveys were very different, by the way, from the more scientific trigonometrical surveys that were being conducted in the rest of India, right? And these surveys were essentially preliminary. They were more kind of susceptible to idiosyncratic factors. They were provisional, and there's a whole literature out there. Especially this book by Simpson is a very interesting book. If any of you guys are interested in knowing how imprecise the mapping of frontier territories, and this is, by the way, this is not just on northwest frontier; it's actually northeastern frontier as well. The same kind of criticism applied. So just as one indication, to show you guys one indication of the imprecision of mapping of the frontiers in British India, I'm going to show you in a short moment this kind of distinction between elongated lines versus triangles when it came to visually looking at maps, right? So elongated lines here essentially suggests in the terminology of these kind of mapping techniques that it's much more imprecise, right? The precision comes from mapping through these triangles in the trigonometrical survey of India maps. So what do I mean by elongated lines versus triangles? Let me just show you a picture. So these are three different snapshots of the kind of trigonometrical surveys of India. One done in 1870, another in 1881, and then another one done in 1907. Across all these three maps, I hope you guys can make it out somewhat. What is absolutely clear is that along the frontiers over here, where I'm running my cursor now, across all these maps, you can see that there are basically lines that are coming out from those kind of frontiers. And whereas the rest of the country, you see these triangles being used to kind of map the landscape. Now, this is clear. Hopefully, this gives a clear indication that it was much less precise. And also, you have lots of blank spaces along the frontiers, whereas you have fewer, kind of more precision and less blank spaces along the interior of the country. And as you see, as you progressively go further and further forward into the future, the kind of presence of these elongated lines versus triangles is a consistent feature of these trigonometrical survey of India maps. This is just to kind of give you an indication. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to the same slide. Just to give you an indication that there was this imprecision, there was this imprecise process of border making in these frontier areas. And we argue that imprecision has an important implication, right? So it has an important implication for us in the sense that the frontier route border itself did not emerge from a rigorous scientific criteria, nor did it correspond to a natural frontier that was marked by distinct geographical discontinuities. And in fact, we will show you evidence, or I will show you evidence shortly of that being the case. We do a whole series of balance tests, which will try and further shore up this argument. Before I move on to showing you the balance test and then moving on to showing you the main result on conflict that we have, let me just mention one more thing over here. So our argument is not that the Northwest region as a whole did not have, or was not conflict prone. The argument is somewhat more subtle than that. So yes, the Northwest region as a whole might have given the British greater resistance, but within, and that might have fed into the initial idea to create frontier rule in this broader region. But within that broader region, the precise mapping of the border itself, which we use for our discontinuity, in our case had an idiosyncrasy built into it. So essentially, the as if random argument only applies to the precise placement of the border within that broader northwestern region, right? So in the sense, our argument is that within that broader region of where the British might have selected that region for frontier rule, the placement of the map was done, a border was done in such a way that we find all these balance across all these dimensions, and they were not differential pre-conflict intensity across that border itself. So let me now basically show you some raw kind of data, and then move on to the more formalized results. So here you have a simple spread of attacks against the state, which we measure in our outcome across the frontier rule border itself, where obviously the black dots are signify incidents against the state. And here we just show a simple raw differences in means, which basically to empirical economists means very little, but at least it's good to just show you that regardless of how we measure conflict against the state, either in terms of the number of incidents or the number of deaths in incidents or the number of injuries in incidents, there's a very strong, statistically significant effect of an increase in across all these different ways of measuring conflict against the state as you move from the non-frontier rule part of the border to the frontier rule part of the border. And we've shown results for the whole sample that we have in the data set, but also within the sample restricted, which we use for most of for all our analysis. In fact, the sample that we use is we restrict the kind of grid cells to being within 50 kilometers of the frontier rule border itself. As I mentioned, I was going to show you balance across a whole range of dimensions. So let's start with balance on geographic, climatic, and historical characteristics. Here we show that, if we looked at ruggedness, again, this is all at the grid cell level, remaining within 50-kilometer buffer zone of the frontier rule border itself. If we looked at, measures of ruggedness, slope, topography, mean precipitation, standard deviation of precipitation, which is also looked at in the conflict literature. We looked at temperature. Across these geographic and climatic variables, being just inside, at least there is no discontinuous change as you move from just outside to just inside the frontier rule border, right? But also looking at historical variables, things like pre-FR conflict intensity or pre-frontier, what we call pre-frontier rule conflict intensity, those kind of conflict incidents or battle incidents that we geocoded or digitized from the book by Jakes, which kind of records all battles from antiquity. We don't find a statistically significant difference, at least for a discontinuity across the border. Again, the same goes for population density as well as weed suitability. Okay, so here is basically a coefficient plot for the same kind of results that I've shown in the previous slide. So these are basically the coefficient plots which encompass the zero line for all those different dimensions I just showed you in that table. The other thing could be, is there a difference in social structure, right, across the frontier rule border? Now, there's this literature, especially a recent paper out, or a relatively recent paper out by Nathan Nunn, Jacob Moscona, and others, which talks about, segmentary lineage societies being more prone to conflict, right? So they argue why segmentary lineage kind of tribal societies could potentially be more, kind of prone to large scale conflict. In our case, both sides of the border is predominantly Pashtun kind of, society, whereby these kind of differences in social structure are somewhat more, closely aligned. But this is indicative evidence to show that. Obviously, both sides of the border as well is our clear majority are Muslims. So at least in the broader sense of, is this coming from different religions or in essence, different, tribal structures. There is some evidence that there is a balance along at least these two broad dimensions of social structure. But in response to a reviewer comment that we got, from one of the journals that we already submitted this paper to, they suggested that these were very broad measures. So perhaps look at more fine-grained measures of religiosity. So the kind of idea there was, okay, if you're showing balance across Muslims, but it's pretty clear that most of the country is Muslim. So that's not a big surprise. Why don't you look at levels of specific levels of religiosity, right? So of the people. So here we utilized a survey data set, which comes from a recent year. On basically looking specifically at, so that survey data set had a module that looked at measures of religiosity, right? And it was an individual level survey where respondents were asked a whole bunch of questions to kind of specifically test for their religiosity. So here we've bunched together those variables into two different subcategories. One we call religious practice. So we try and see if there are differences across the frontier rule border in the intensity of religious practice amongst people, but also in terms of their religious knowledge, right? So if you focus on religious practice first, so things like Dars-e-Quran, frequency of the Dars-e-Quran, prayers during the week, how many prayers during the week, prayers on Friday, tahajjud, and all these different variables of religious practice, they're very similar. In other words, we don't find a statistically significant difference across the frontier rule border, across these various dimensions of religious practice. The same can be said about various measures along, religious knowledge, religious knowledge of the people. So, whether they know the first verse in the Quran, can they recite that? Do they know about the role of, physical punishment? And so on and so forth. All these kind of dimensions that we try to hopefully, kind of bracket into either religious practice or religious knowledge, we do find that there is this balance across these dimensions. So, similar religiosity, so to speak, similar social structure, which kind of is linked to that result. And similar kind of, geophysical as well as historical pre-conflict, kind of dimensions. The other important kind of question, obviously, is that were these places, because this is a historical treatment, so it could be that, once the border was created, there were some very different measures of migration, and that could have caused differences in conflict later on. So here we show that, at least if one were to look at simply compare the growth in population rates across these two periods. I mean, we took the periods for which we had data. Unfortunately, we couldn't find data from going beyond before 1981. But if you were to compare the growth in population between 81 and 98, which are the two census years, to the following two census years, 98 and 2017, we see very little difference. So this indicates that head population counts, growth rates are very similar across the two different census periods. And if you looked at their coefficient plots, you find very high levels of similarity there as well. In other words, there's no difference between the cumulative, density functions of the two population growth rates across the two census periods. So very similar population growth rates. In other words, no, kind of most likely driven by natural growth rather than huge population shocks. Okay, and we also use some survey data, by the way, to kind of further look at whether migration rates differ across the frontier and non-frontier regions, and we find evidence that there's not much statistically significant difference in these areas in those dimensions either. Recent scholarship, there's a paper by Jack Payne and others, which basically is focused on Africa, but does talk about the fact that colonial borders in particular were determined by either what they call geographic focal points. So these could be rivers, water bodies, mountain ranges, and so on and so forth. or they could also be determined by pre-colonial borders. So in their case, they show that at least inter-imperial borders had this kind of significant element of either geographical focal features or pre-colonial borders, determining what the actual inter-imperial borders were. Our finding is that actually, if you looked at these focal features like rivers and water bodies, there is very little intersection between major rivers and the frontier rule border itself, or there is very little intersection as represented by these black dots. Sorry if they're not that magnified. I had to just fit in all this in a single slide. So regardless of whether you looked at, the intersection of the frontier rule border with major rivers in this region or with water bodies, you don't find much evidence of that in this case. The other thing we look at is what was the main pre-colonial kind of empire in this region, the major empire. We look at the Sikh Empire. We compare the frontier rule border to the border of the Sikh Empire, and again we do find some overlap, but it's like it's compared to the rest of the border itself, the overlap is very minimal. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure out a way to get back to the old slide. Yeah, so basically, having shown you that there is this little kind of feeding into the frontier rule border, this kind of rivers and water bodies, focal features, as well as pre-colonial empires. And why is that the case? We think in our paper we argue that while the Jack Payne paper on Africa talks about inter-imperial borders in Africa, our case study is really more about an intra-imperial border within the British Empire that separated frontier rule from non-frontier rule areas, right? So we're not really talking about inter-imperial borders. We're talking about an intra-imperial border. Where kind of the British had to kind of construct this border in a very kind of a challenging landscape, whereby their abilities to track and space track out space, geographic space was limited, as represented through the elongated lines in the treasure metal survey of India maps that I showed you earlier. Okay, so let's look at our main result, which is essentially we find across these various dimensions of conflict against the state, much higher intensity of conflict, regardless of the kind of measure that we use, whether it's incidents against the states, deaths in incidents against the state, or injuries in incidents against the state. Here is a visual kind of representation of the discontinuity itself. There's a clear difference in the levels, as well as there's no overlap in the confidence intervals when you look at conflicts against incidents against the state, or deaths in incidents against the state, or injuries in incidents against the state. We do a whole bunch of robustness tests. I'm not going to discuss any of those. I'm just going to literally show you guys this slide and then move on from there in the interest of time. So basically, we alternate the buffer zone. Remember, our main buffer zone was 50 kilometers either side of the frontier rule border. We alternate that. We decrease the buffer
Rinchan,
zone.
can you hear me now?
We change the border segment fixed effects. We use alternative conflict data, alternative bandwidth, and so on and so forth. And we find that across all these range of dimensions, regardless of these robustness tests, our results are pretty robust to trying any of these. Sorry, how much time do I have left? I just wanted to check.
Rinchan, we've been trying to tell you you have 3-4 minutes left, because we'd like to leave time for questions afterwards.
Perfect. Okay, sure. I'll only take like 3 or 4 minutes more. Thank you for reminding me. Thanks. Okay, so like Faiz mentioned in his kind of opening discussion, our argument is not that this historical frontier rule in and of itself always leads to higher conflict. Actually, it can maintain social order for long periods of time, right? And it's only in the face of shocks, which we consider the shock to the main shock for us is the 9/11 and the ensuing war on terror. which kind of then leads to a divergence in conflict levels in the frontier rule areas relative to the non-frontier rule areas. So to kind of unpack that aggregate result, I'm just showing you the raw trends between frontier rule and non-frontier rule areas, and then an event study plot where we can specifically track when the conflict starts to emerge or differentially emerge in the frontier rule areas relative to the non-frontier rule areas. And if you focus on either of these plots, it's quite clear that it's a post 9/11 phenomenon, right? So it's with that dashed line here is 9/11. The shaded area on the left-hand side is post 9/11 era, and you can clearly see that it's a very much a post 9/11 phenomenon. And in fact, if you were to distinguish our sample for the spatial RD pre and post 9/11, all the action really comes from the post 9/11 era. Why is that the case? And then I will end my kind of presentation on this. Again, like Faiz mentioned, 9/11 for us is really a shock, and primarily a shock to people's sentiment against the state. So we show, using various measures, that as soon as 9/11 happens, this is a massive universal shock, universally disallowed. The war on terror in Pakistan's involvement in it with the United States in the war on terror is looked upon as very unfavorably throughout the country. So it's a massive negative shock to people's sentiment against the state. And here is some polling kind of evidence on that. There's more evidence in the paper on that as well. For us, this all pervasive rise in anti state sentiment essentially only leads to this continuous rise in violence in the frontier rule areas, precisely because avenues of conflict management, as Faiz was saying, were much more restricted. There was less recourse to MNAs, so electoral politics was very underdeveloped in these regions, and comes from a contemporary period. So there was some electoral politics, as Faiz mentioned, after 1997, but again, the recourse to MNAs was very limited. There's very little contact with MNAs. Recourse to Jirga, which was the primary interlocutor between state and society, was much higher in these regions. And one final piece of evidence that I wanted to kind of show you guys is that, this idea that Faiz mentioned, that social order in these regions primarily hinged on the ability of local tribal elites to intermediate between the state and society. And what started happening after 9/11 is that these tribal elites, precisely these tribal elites, were being assassinated by the insurgents, right? So here, if you see, there's a clear discontinuous increase in attacks against and incidents against tribal elders in the frontier rule areas relative to the non-frontier rule areas right after 9/11. And that kind of assassination of tribal elders, and here is a staggered event study for that. So here, this red line is basically signifying the first ever time a tribal elder is attacked in the grid cell in which people reside, and you can see that there is a clear acceleration of violence shortly after the first attack against the tribal elder in the frontier rule area. Right. So essentially, this idea that primary linchpin between the primary interlocutor between state society, the tribal elder, is attacked as a prime strategy for insurgents in these areas to remove the last vestige, so to speak, of social order, and you have maximum chaos ensuing. So that kind of brings in the vulnerability argument that frontier rule is inherently vulnerable because it depends on so much on these tribal elders, and it has such few avenues of conflict management that kind of feeds into our framework in terms of the mechanisms behind the results that we see of post 9/11 rise in violence in FR areas. I think that's where I'm going to stop. That pretty much summarizes our argument, and happy to take any questions along with Faiz. Thank you, and sorry for going above by a couple of minutes. Apologies for that.
Okay, that's fantastic. I think we have time for Faiz, if you want to collect your questions and either answer them directly or hand them over to Rinchan, we can do that.
In terms of The line which has been drawn to separate two portions of the same land, and after a arrangement of like 100 years, they behaved differently because they were administered differently. The hypothesis, does it mean that actually that line has created the difference, and had this line not been there, they would have behaved similarly? Now the question is, has the line been drawn with some sort of understanding of the geographical or the behavioral differences, or was it arbitrary and it was the impact of that?
Hi, I'm Ajaz. Government has recently merged this frontier region into KPK and province, and then Pakistan Army has also erected the fence all across the Afghanistan border. What is the impact? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first question is about the line has created a difference in behavior of the people on one side related to the other side. So actually, it was the institution of governance which has created such difference. On the non-frontier regions, what we call the settled districts, they have formal conflict management institution, because when they have some grievances against the state, so they will participate in electoral politics. They will take, you can say, their frustration in political grading, political protest, while on the frontier region, these things were not allowed. And they were controlled mainly through the tribal elites. So there were, you can say, a restriction on protest. And till now, after the merger, and this question is, the answer is also related to the second question, that after the merger, still, although the politics have been allowed, but still the protests are other things through which the population can show their grievances against the state, they are strictly prohibited. And even means of communication like access to the internet, access to the social media, they have been strictly prohibited in those areas. So the argument is that the grievances in these regions, because of no avenues of conflict management, accumulated with the time, and at the end, it lead to conflict against the state. The question is about the merger, as discussed by Rinchan, that although the merger has been happened, but still, you can say the merger is not completed by 100%, because still they don't have proper institution of police, courts, judiciary, uh, you can say permission to electoral politics, etc.
Could I just quickly add to that, Faiz, or do you want to take more questions?
You can reply.
Yeah, so basically, the question about what discontinuity it is that we're looking at. So essentially, we're focusing on an historical institutional discontinuity, which we argue has sustained itself in the post-colonial period. And that institutional discontinuity consists of, as Faz, very correctly and eloquently mentioned, that the lack of conflict management institutions. So if you think of conflict management institutions like electoral politics, like courts, system of courts, a bureaucracy, so on and so forth, in terms of shock absorbers, right? So think of these as shock absorbers. And the shock to us is people's sentiment against the state after 9/11 and Pakistan's kind of collusion with the US in the war on terror. Those shock absorbers, we argue, were not there in this differential frontier rule system. Right? And the lack of shock absorbers that this system inherently kind of suffered from, so to speak, then basically unlocks violence against the state. So just wanted to mention that.
So this is probably the way that described it, Rinchan, but I see somewhat of an inherent tension between describing the frontier states as being inherently unstable because of this lack of institutions related to conflict management, and the fact that you need a design in which, since their formation, you don't see any differences between frontier states and other states at baseline. What is it about 9/11, given that each of us can probably think of many other shocks that have occurred to this region, both economic and non-economic shocks that haven't actually triggered such violence? It's something specific about 9/11 as a shock that's led to this diversion path, because no other shock has led to any differences pre 9/11. So I'm just trying to reconcile those two sort of views of the world.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks. That's a very important comment. In fact, unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through many of the competing explanations that we try and address. So it's absolutely clear that there is this tension between, why was there social order basically in this area for a relatively long period of time, and then suddenly you see a unlocking of violence after 9/11, right? So the argument that we try and focus on in the paper really is that for us, 9/11 represents an increase in people's resentment, people's grievances vis-a-vis the state. And in particular, in this region, that translates via their historical kind of institutional discontinuity into violence against the state. So the other potential way to think about this is, one argument could be, could it be the case that 9/11 led to military operations in these areas, and it's the military operations that cause the rise in violence, and not necessarily anything to do with this historical discontinuity or people's sentiment against the state caused by 9/11? So in the paper, also in the slides, but I didn't have time to kind of go through that, unfortunately, we deal with that by showing that if you were to look at the rise in military operations in these areas, they post date the rise in conflict. So essentially, the Granger causality argument that conflict had already risen in these areas, and then it was only post the rise in and through event study plots, by comparison of event studies, we're able to show that military operations only come afterwards. So they come as a response of the state to a pre-existing rise in violence in these areas. The other kind of dimension that we try and look at is this simply a spillover from Afghanistan, right? Could this be that there was violence, there was like a US invasion of Afghanistan? Could there be a spillover? I mean, we can't definitively rule out that kind of competing explanation, but we do present a whole series of evidence to kind of try and show that if, for instance, we were to take grid cells that are bordering Afghanistan, or closer to, nearer to Afghanistan, if we took all those grid cells out of our sample, we still see that the effect remains. We look at visual kind of spread of conflict across Afghanistan versus Pakistan, and we try and address the issue of spillover that way. We also include a distance to the Afghan border as an additional control. And essentially, other competing explanations that are linked to 9/11 that could potentially explain this result. So in the paper, essentially, we take the view that 9/11 for us is really this kind of straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, right? So which is the invasion of Afghanistan, Pakistan's stance, under General Musharraf to kind of then side with the US in their war on terror, which kind of leads to this kind of shock to people's sentiment against the state, which then essentially translates into actual violence against the state, because in these areas you did not have, for instance, electoral politics. The rise of MMA is a clear indicator that MMA and its right-wing vote rises after this period, whereas no such thing is even allowed or is there necessarily in the tribal areas at an advanced level, so to speak. So essentially that kind of argument and linked to that, coupled to that, is this idea that the primary interlocutor between state and society, the tribal elites, are the ones who were assassinated. Whereas on the other side, in the non-frontier rule areas, you have other options, right? You can go to courts, you have electoral politics, you have the bureaucracy, you have different ways of channelizing grievances. But in this area, the main interlocutor is taken out, and also you have fewer conflict management institutions to begin with. Sorry, that was that.
Okay, thank you. We should probably
Sorry for the long-winded kind of answer.
We should probably wrap up there so we have enough time for a break before the next session. So thanks to both speakers, well, all three speakers for this session.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us. Very enjoyable. Thank you.